He hollowed out a huge oak tree, and everyone laughed at him. Neighbors, passers-by, even children. No one understood why the man spent his days in the forest with his tools. But one day, when a downpour hit the village and water flooded the streets, everyone ran to the place they had previously laughed at. Look what someone else's madness turned into. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The first time the villagers saw Ethan Morris walk into the forest carrying a hammer and a chisel, they thought it was a brief episode of grief, a passing madness brought on by loneliness. The man had lost everything, they said. His wife in a car crash, his son in the same twisted wreckage. He had returned to the countryside after years in the city, trading blueprints for silence, and nobody really knew what he planned to do there. His small cottage stood on the edge of the woods, where the earth dipped into green shadow and the air smelled of damp roots. Most evenings, a thin column of smoke rose from his chimney and then vanished without a trace, like every rumor about him eventually did. But that morning, he was different. He had purpose in his steps, tools in his hands, and a strange calm in his eyes. At first, people laughed. The sight of a middle-aged man climbing a ladder to hammer at the base of a giant oak seemed absurd. The tree itself was a landmark, so thick that it would take 5 men to encircle it, so old that even the eldest in the village could not remember when it had first sprouted. Ethan pressed his hand to its bark, as though greeting an old friend, tracing the deep lines that ran like rivers through its surface. Then he began to carve. Each strike of the hammer echoed through the quiet forest, measured and steady. Birds flew off in brief alarm, leaves trembled, and the sound settled into a rhythm that would soon become a part of the forest's daily pulse. The villagers talked. In the grocery store, by the riverbank, near the school gates, everywhere someone had an opinion. He's lost his mind, they said. He's digging himself a grave. A few pitied him, others mocked him. Children followed him once, shouting nicknames like Tree Man or Wood Hermit, until his silence unnerved them enough to scatter back home. Ethan never argued, never explained. He nodded politely when greeted, then returned to his work. What nobody knew was that the steady tap of his hammer wasn't madness. It was memory. 20 years earlier, Ethan had watched another kind of water carve through his life. A flood had swept across the valley when the old dam failed, and in one night it had devoured his hometown. His father, George Morris, had gone out to help the neighbors evacuate. Ethan, then 12 years old, had stood on the roof, clutching a lantern, watching the black water swallow barns, fences, and lights. His father never returned. The next morning, all that remained was debris tangled in the trees and the smell of rot in the air. Since that day, Ethan carried the sound of rushing water in his dreams, a warning that never faded. Years later, when grief took his own family from him, he sold his house in the city and came back to the valley. But he did not return as the same man. He came as someone searching for a way to repay a debt to the past. He wanted to build something that could not be washed away, something that could outlast the storms men laughed at until it was too late. The great oak on the hill called to him the first week he arrived. It stood rooted in a mound of earth that had survived every flood, its trunk unscarred, its branches strong enough to cradle thunder. When Ethan placed his palm on the bark for the first time, he felt a pulse, slow, ancient, patient. It was as if the tree was breathing beneath his hand. He began carefully, chiseling a narrow slit just large enough to peer into the heart of the wood. The interior was solid, dense, but dry. He measured with an engineer's precision, testing angles, marking points with charcoal. Over the next days, the slit widened into an arched opening, tall enough for a man to crawl through. He reinforced the edges with planks, brushed the raw wood with oil to keep it from cracking. When rain fell, he He covered the opening with a tarp and sat beneath it, listening to the rhythm of droplets against the bark. The forest began to accept him. Squirrels returned to the branches, birds perched above his ladder. Even the occasional fox passed by without fear. To Ethan, the tree no longer felt like a project. It felt like partnership. But in the village, patience for eccentricity was thin. Someone filmed him one afternoon, Ethan on the ladder, sweat glinting on his forehead, hammer in hand, and posted the video online. Within days, strangers laughed at him across screens. "Crazy man building a home in a tree," read one caption. Another joked, "Fairy house construction, phase 1. Local teenagers started leaving crude notes at the edge of the forest. Still, Ethan never answered. When asked by a curious shopkeeper what he was making, he only said, "Something that might matter when nothing else does." Inside his mind, he replayed a different kind of conversation, the one he never had with his father. He remembered his father's calloused hands, the way he used to say that everything strong starts small. "Even a fortress begins with a single nail," George had once said, driving one into a beam while Ethan watched. The memory became his compass. Each stroke of the chisel, each shaved curl of wood that fell to the ground, felt like a way of speaking back to that long-ago voice. He wasn't carving madness. He was carving meaning. Weeks turned into months. The hollow inside the oak deepened into a small chamber. Ethan reinforced the interior with wooden ribs that followed the natural grain, creating a shell within the shell. He used waterproof resin mixed from pine sap and charcoal dust to coat the walls, turning them smooth and dark. He installed a wooden floor raised slightly above the ground to keep the moisture out, then built a narrow ledge that could serve as a bench or a bed. He brought in a small lantern, hung it from a hook above the entrance. At night, the glow spilled faintly through the arched doorway, and from a distance, the tree seemed alive, as if some spirit burned within. Sometimes, as he worked, the forest whispered around him. The breeze moved through the leaves with a low sigh, and Ethan imagined the tree speaking in a language older than his grief. He spoke back quietly, telling it things no one else could hear, about his father, his wife, his son, about how helpless he had felt when water turned the world into chaos. The more he talked, the lighter his chest became. He began to think of the hollow, not only as shelter, but as confession. In its quiet center, he could remember without breaking. Late in the summer, 3 men from the village came to confront him. They had been drinking and wanted a spectacle. They stood near the base of the tree, jeering, telling him he was destroying nature. One of them raised a phone, filming, demanding that he explain himself. Ethan looked down from the ladder, sweat glistening on his arms, and said nothing. He turned back to his work. The men laughed louder, called him names, until one of them noticed the light inside the hollow. A flickering candle placed carefully at the back. "He's holding rituals," one shouted. They left soon after, shaking their heads, satisfied with their own cruelty. Ethan watched them go, then blew out the candle, letting the smoke drift into the dark like a silent prayer. That night, sitting beside the tree, he pulled from his pocket a small photograph creased at the corners. It showed his father standing beside a young boy, both smiling, both holding carpentry tools. The sky behind them was clear, the ground dry, the dam still whole. Ethan traced the outline of his father's hand on the photo. "Now I understand," he whispered. The wind stirred the branches above him, as if in answer. The forest accepted his vow. By autumn, the entrance had taken shape, a pointed arch polished smooth, almost like a chapel door. The ground around the roots was swept clean, the path leading to it packed firm from his footsteps. Some villagers grew used to the sight and stopped caring. Others, still curious, kept their distance. Only one old man, Mr. Carter, once a carpenter himself, came quietly one evening and watched. "You're sealing it?" he asked. Ethan nodded. "Why here?" Carter said. Ethan looked at the horizon, where the river shimmered faintly beyond the fields. "Because this ground never drowned," he replied. The old man nodded slowly, as if recognizing something he could not name, and left without another word. Winter began to crawl into the valley. Frost painted the grass silver, and mist clung to the forest in the mornings. Ethan continued to work. His hands grew rougher, his beard thicker. The hollow inside the tree was finished, but his mind was restless. He brought in blankets, dry food, a small first aid kit, bottles of water, batteries, a shortwave radio. He tested the space during a storm, closing the door and waiting through the night. The sound of rain drummed against the bark, but not a drop leaked inside. When he emerged in the morning, the forest sparkled under thin sunlight, and he smiled for the first time in months. From then on, he came every day, not just to build, but to tend to maintain, to listen. The tree became part of him, and he part of it. People still called him the mad man of the woods, but he no longer cared. His world had shrunk to the rhythm of his breath and the steady pulse beneath the bark. He believed that one day the purpose of all this would reveal itself, that when the next storm came, and it always did, someone would find refuge here. He didn't know who. He didn't need to. It was enough to know that when the water returned, there would finally be a place that refused to fall. The first chapter of his new life ended the evening he lit a lantern inside the hollow and stepped back to watch. The light flickered gently, painting golden patterns on the bark. The wind whispered through the leaves like a sigh of relief. And though he stood alone, the air around him felt inhabited by memory, by promise, by something enduring that no flood could ever take away. When winter melted into a gray and restless spring, the forest changed its tone. The soil softened beneath Ethan's boots, and the old oak's bark darkened with rain. The hollow he had carved now felt like a living heart beating inside the tree, and every morning when he entered it, he could smell the blend of wood oil, earth, and the faint sweetness of pine sap. What had once been a hollow chamber was now something more deliberate, a space that seemed to breathe, to hold not just air, but meaning. Outside, the laughter of the villagers had faded into the background hum of their daily lives. The novelty of his work had worn off. Only a few still mentioned his name in passing, usually with a shrug or a shake of the head. He had become part of the landscape, like the tree itself, strange, immovable, quietly persistent. Inside the hollow, Ethan worked with the precision of a man who built not for comfort, but for endurance. He reinforced the ribs with narrow wooden braces, sanded the floor until it was smooth enough to sit on without splinters, and applied another coat of resin to seal every seam. The space glowed warmly when he lit the lantern, shadows flickering over the curved walls. He tested every corner, knocked on the wood to hear the sound of strength or weakness. When rain drummed on the bark, the sound came as a deep, even murmur-like, the pulse of a great creature sleeping through the storm. He had made it strong enough to resist water, wind, and perhaps even time itself. And yet, what he was truly building could not be measured by structure alone. He would often sit there in silence, staring at the faint circle of light cast by the lantern, and find himself speaking without realizing it. The words came as whispers, addressed not to anyone present, but to someone long gone. He spoke to his father as though the man were sitting just across from him. "You would have liked this place," he would murmur. "You'd have told me to make the joints tighter, the seal thicker. You'd have asked why I'm wasting time on something that might never be used. And then, when I told you, you'd understand." He smiled at that thought, though the smile never reached his eyes. "You died because there was nowhere to go," he continued, "because no one believed it could happen. But if it ever happens again, if the water comes back, someone will have a place to hide." Outside, spring storms began to gather. Clouds stacked along the horizon like dark mountains, and the air carried that charged silence that precedes lightning. Ethan spent more time in the woods, checking the tree, repairing the path, tightening the bolts on the door. He watched the river swell each week as the snow melted in the mountains. The old stories returned to the valley, of the year when the dam broke, of the water that came in the night. But most people dismissed them. "That was long ago," they said in town. "The new dam's stronger." Only Ethan knew better. He had studied the patterns, the shifting soil, the way the water crept higher after each season. Nothing built by men was ever beyond failure. He had learned that truth from experience, and it lived in his bones. One afternoon, as thunder rolled distantly, he saw a group of teenagers at the edge of the forest. They were pointing at the oak, whispering. Then one of them shouted his name. "Hey, Noah's back! How's the ark?" Their laughter echoed, harsh and hollow. Ethan didn't answer. He wiped his hands on his trousers and walked toward them until they took a step back, uncertain. His silence was heavy, unflinching. Then he turned and returned to the tree. The boys left, muttering. That night, he stayed longer than usual inside the hollow. He lit 2 candles instead of 1, and sat watching their light dance against the walls. "They don't understand," he whispered to the air. "They never do, until the water's at their door." By early summer, the storms had become regular, each one a little stronger than the last. The forest grew lush and wild, ferns spreading like green fire across the ground. Ethan carried more supplies into the hollow blankets: dry food, a small radio, extra batteries, a first aid kit. He arranged them carefully along the shelves he had built, labeling each tin and container. It looked, to a stranger, like a survivalist's fantasy. To Ethan, it was a promise kept. Each item was a stone laid in the invisible monument he was building to his father's memory. He didn't plan to use it himself. He was building it for whoever might need it when fear returned to the valley. At night, lightning turned the forest white for a heartbeat at a time, and the oak loomed like a cathedral's tower. Inside, Ethan lay awake, listening to the rain. He could tell by the pitch of the drops how close the water was to overflowing. He heard the river's voice grow restless, rising in tone, growing in urgency. It was as if the earth itself were warning him. He closed his eyes and thought of the night his father had vanished, how the world had seemed to tilt, how the stars had disappeared behind a wall of cloud. He had promised, as a child, that if he ever had the chance, he would build something strong enough to stand against such a night. He hadn't kept that promise then, but he was keeping it now. The next morning, he found the first sign. The small creek that ran near the base of the hill had burst its banks, carrying mud and branches across the path. The soil was soft beneath his boots, slick with water. When he bent to touch it, he felt the ground shiver faintly, as if alive. He knew what that meant. The underground channels were filling. The forest was becoming a sponge. Within days, the lower parts of the valley would start to flood. He stood for a long time, staring toward the horizon, where the river curved through the fields. From that distance, it looked peaceful, silver under the gray sky. But he knew how quickly peace could turn to panic. He spent the following days strengthening the oak's entrance, adding metal brackets, sealing every edge. He lined the bottom of the interior with waterproof fabric and built a narrow step just inside the doorway to keep water from spilling in. He tested the radio, tuned it to the emergency frequencies, and left it running at low volume. Static hummed softly, the sound of distant storms speaking in broken voices. On the fourth day, the broadcast changed. A calm, official voice announced heavy rainfall, risk of flooding near the river's northern curve, evacuation warnings for low-lying areas. Ethan listened in silence. He didn't feel fear, only inevitability. That evening, as the first drops began to fall, he went outside and stood under the tree. The sky above him was bruised and swollen, the wind carrying the smell of electricity. He could feel the storm's weight pressing down on the valley, as though the heavens themselves were leaning closer. Lightning flashed behind the hills, followed by a long, rolling thunder that seemed to shake the very air. The oak groaned softly, its branches twisting but not breaking. Ethan reached out and pressed his palm to the bark. "We're ready," he said quietly. "You and I." He built a small fire near the roots and waited, watching the light flicker over the bark, listening to the growing roar of the rain. The forest came alive with movement. Birds fleeing, small animals darting through the undergrowth. He stayed until the fire hissed out under the downpour, then stepped inside the hollow, closing the door behind him. The sound of the storm outside was muffled, but constant, a living wall of sound. He sat down on the wooden bench and watched the candlelight tremble. In the brief pauses between thunder, he could hear the creak of the tree adjusting to the wind. It felt like being inside a ship at sea, surrounded by an endless tide of noise and motion. Yet he was calm. Every plank, every seal, every bolt had been placed by his own hands. Whatever came, he was ready to meet it. Hours passed. The radio crackled with scattered reports. Roads closed, bridges failing, water levels rising faster than expected. He leaned back against the wall and listened, the candle's flame steady despite the shaking world. It was strange, he thought, how peace could exist in the center of chaos. For years he had built this place to quiet the noise in his mind, and now, as the real storm raged outside, he felt that same quiet expand until it filled him completely. He thought again of his father and whispered into the dim light, "If you could see it now, you'd know I finally kept my promise." Sometime after midnight, the wind rose to a howl. Rain lashed the door like fists. Ethan closed his eyes and imagined the village, the narrow streets turning to rivers, the shouts, the confusion, the disbelief. He pictured the faces of the men who had mocked him, the children who had thrown stones near the forest edge. They would be awake now, frightened, wondering where to go. He wished, not for the first time, that he had explained. But words never carried as far as action, and his actions were here, inside this living wall of oak and faith. As dawn approached, he felt exhaustion pull at him. The candle burned low, the air inside the hollow warm and dry. He lay down on the wooden bench, hands folded on his chest, and listened to the heartbeat of rain against the bark. The rhythm was almost like breathing. He thought of his father's voice one last time, steady, deep, full of the wisdom that only simple men seem to carry. "Everything strong starts small," George had said. Ethan smiled faintly in the half-light. The tree above him trembled once, then settled. He drifted into sleep, not knowing that the real test of his work would come with the morning, when the water would finally reach the forest's edge. Outside, the storm gathered its full strength. The river broke free from its channel, and the valley began to disappear beneath a moving mirror of gray. In the heart of the woods, the old oak stood unbent, its hollow glowing faintly through the rain, like an ember refusing to die. By the time the first pale light of morning touched the valley, the storm had already devoured most of it. The river had broken its banks and swallowed the fields, turning roads into dark, twisting streams. From the hollow of the oak, Ethan awoke to the dull, rhythmic drumming of rain against the bark. The world outside was unrecognizable, an echoing sea of sound and motion. The radio hissed faintly beside him, murmuring words between bursts of static. Roads closed, power outages, evacuation in progress. The same calm voice repeated the same warnings, though he knew it was already too late for most. He could hear it in the tone, the unspoken panic that came when control slipped away. He pushed open the wooden door and was met by a sheet of water pouring down the slope. The air smelled of wet soil and broken branches. The sky hung low, heavy and bruised, the clouds swirling like smoke. He stepped into the rain, pulling his coat tighter around him, and looked down the valley. The village roofs were barely visible, small islands in a rising flood. The church steeple still stood, but the bells were silent. He could hear faint cries, carried on the wind. People shouting to one another, calling for help, voices swallowed by distance and rain. For a moment he hesitated, his hand still resting on the doorframe. Then he turned back inside, grabbed the lantern and a rope, and started down the hill. The mud sucked at his boots, and branches whipped against his legs. The forest seemed alive, not with peace, but with struggled trees bending under the wind, the sound of roots groaning deep beneath the earth. The path he had walked 100 times was gone, replaced by rushing water. He waded through it, waist-deep in places, his breath ragged but steady. Every instinct told him to stay in the hollow, to wait it out. But another voice, older, firmer, one that sounded like his father, drove him forward. He could not stand by while others drowned. That had been the mistake of the world before him, the one his father had died trying to correct. If there was any purpose to what he had built, it had to be now. He reached the edge of the forest, where the land sloped sharply toward the village. The houses below were already half submerged. Cars drifted like toys along the main street, colliding with fences and vanishing under the current. A group of people were clinging to the roof of a small shop, waving frantically. He shouted, but the wind stole his words. Still, one of them saw him, a woman clutching a child to her chest. She pointed toward him, hope flickering in her eyes even from a distance. Ethan raised his lantern high and motioned toward the forest. He knew the ground behind him would hold. The water would reach at last, if at all. He waved again, urging them to move. For a moment they hesitated. Then one man dropped into the flood, pulling a makeshift raft behind him. The others followed. He waited until they began their slow, desperate climb toward him, then turned and headed back uphill to prepare. The hollow glowed like a beacon in the storm when he reached it. He lit more lanterns, hung them near the entrance, so the light spilled out in wide arcs. The inside looked small compared to the fury of the world outside, but it was dry, solid, warm. He dragged in extra blankets, checked the food, the water, the batteries. When he returned to the doorway, he saw movement below. Figures struggling through the rain, stumbling over roots. There were more than he expected, not just the family from the roof, but others from the lower fields who must have seen the light. Their clothes were soaked, faces pale, eyes wide with exhaustion and disbelief. Some carried children, others just clung to one another, driven forward by fear more than strength. Ethan ran toward them, shouting over the roar of the storm. "This way! Keep moving! You're almost there!" They reached him one by one, shivering and gasping, too cold to speak. He guided them into the hollow, helping them sit, handing out blankets and bottles of water. The air inside quickly filled with the smell of rain and damp wool, but it was safe. The walls did not tremble. The floor stayed dry. The tree seemed to embrace them all, its roots steady beneath the rising flood. Outside, the wind screamed through the forest, but inside there was a hush, broken only by quiet sobs and the low hum of the radio. Ethan moved among them, checking each face, offering what comfort he could. When he reached the woman with the child, she caught his wrist and whispered through chattering teeth, "You built this?" He nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "God bless you," she said. He shook his head. "No," he replied softly. "It wasn't God, just wood. And time." Hours passed, though no one could tell how many. The world outside remained a blur of water and lightning. From time to time, someone would start to cry or whisper prayers under their breath. A man asked if the tree would fall. Ethan told him no, though he didn't know for certain. He trusted the roots more than anything else left standing in that valley. The children eventually fell asleep against their mother's shoulders, lulled by the strange steadiness of the storm's rhythm. Every creak of the wood sounded like a heartbeat, slow and patient. The hollow, built for solitude, had become a sanctuary for life itself. When the worst of the night began to fade, Ethan dared to open the door again. The rain had eased into a steady drizzle, and gray light filtered through the mist. What he saw made his breath catch. The entire valley was a lake. The village was gone, replaced by a vast, silent expanse of brown water. Only the tops of trees broke the surface, marking where streets and fences had been. A few rooftops still protruded, glistening like small islands, and on one of them, a dog stood barking helplessly. Ethan turned away. The sight was too much like his boyhood memory, the same stillness after chaos, the same smell of mud and loss. He closed the door and sat down, feeling the weight of it all settle in his chest. As daylight grew stronger, the people began to stir. Some ventured to the entrance, peering out in disbelief. They asked questions he couldn't answer. Was their home gone? Were their families safe? Would help come? He told them only what he knew, that they were safe for now, that the water would take time to recede, that someone would come eventually. It wasn't enough, but it was something. The woman with the child stayed close to him, quiet, watchful. When her son woke and began to cry, she hushed him with a soft hum. Ethan listened to the sound, fragile and human, and for the first time in years felt something warm rise in him that wasn't grief. It was purpose, simple and profound. By noon, the rain had stopped. The air was heavy with steam, and shafts of sunlight pierced through the thinning clouds. Birds began to return, their calls tentative, but bright. When Ethan opened the door once more, he felt a strange calm wash over him. The world was wrecked, but alive. The great oak stood untouched, its bark gleaming dark and strong. Around it, the water still swirled, but lower now, receding inch by inch. He stepped outside and saw that the villagers had begun to emerge too. They moved carefully, helping one another, climbing out of the forest like survivors from another age. When they saw him, they stopped. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the same woman, her face streaked with tears and mud, said, "He saved us." Others nodded, murmuring words he couldn't hear. Ethan looked down, embarrassed, then turned his gaze to the tree. "It wasn't me," he said quietly. "It was this." In the days that followed, rescue crews arrived from neighboring towns. Boats floated across what used to be fields, collecting the stranded, carrying them to dry land. Journalists came too, asking questions, taking pictures. They wrote about the man who had lived in the woods, the mad builder, whose tree had saved a dozen lives. Ethan avoided them all. He helped where he could, lifting debris, guiding rescuers. But when they called his name, he kept walking. He had no interest in explanations. What had happened was simple, a promise fulfilled, nothing more. When they finally drained the last of the floodwater and the earth began to breathe again, the villagers returned to what was left of their homes. Most were gone. Some were repairable. But everyone came, at least once, to see the oak. They found the entrance sealed now, the door shut and bolted from within. Ethan had left it that way after cleaning the inside, removing the last of the blankets and supplies. On the ground near the roots, he had carved a small wooden plaque. The letters were rough, but clear, a place that remembered what men forgot. Beneath it, smaller words read, Morris Shelter. Someone brought flowers and placed them there. Others followed, leaving notes, candles, simple tokens of thanks. The tree became a place of quiet pilgrimage, a reminder of humility and endurance. Children grew up hearing the story of the man who built a home in a tree and saved a village, though those who had lived through it knew it wasn't heroism that had driven him. It was memory and love. Ethan never left the valley. He rebuilt the roof of his small cottage and tended the garden that the flood had spared. Sometimes he would walk to the hill and sit at the base of the oak, his hand resting on its bark. It still felt alive beneath his fingers, pulsing faintly, the same way it had that first day. He would close his eyes and listen, hearing in its creaks and whispers the voice of his father, the laughter of his son, the echo of the storm. The villagers still greeted him now, with quiet respect instead of ridicule. Some stopped to talk. Others simply nodded. He said little, preferring silence, for the world seemed loud enough without his words. The oak spoke for him now. Years later, when the valley had long since recovered, the government built a memorial at the site of the old floodplain. They called it the Shelter of Roots. It stood near the tree, simple and small, with a bench facing the valley. On the bench was an inscription, "In memory of those who build before they are believed." No one knew exactly who had chosen the words, but everyone agreed they fit. Sometimes travelers would come and sit there without knowing the full story, feeling only that strange peace the place carried. And somewhere nearby, always unseen, Ethan's lantern would still burn at dusk, its faint light flickering through the bark, steady as a heartbeat. The oak never fell. Through summers and winters, through frost and lightning, it stood as it always had, strong, patient, eternal. And though Ethan's hair turned white and his hands grew frail, he would visit it until the end, carrying his tools not to build, but to touch, to remember. When people asked why he still came, he would smile and say only, to make sure it's still standing. And in that answer lived everything. The loss, the love, the redemption. The man once called mad had become a guardian of quiet truth, and the tree, once mocked as a monument to folly, had become a monument to faith. When he died, many years later, they buried him at the foot of the oak. The villagers gathered in silence, their faces lit by lanterns just like the ones he had once hung inside the hollow. The wind moved through the branches softly, as though the tree itself were mourning, and when the ceremony was over and the people had gone, the forest returned to stillness. The oak remained, rooted in the earth, its heart hollow but strong, a shelter waiting for the next storm, a promise whispered into the wind that some things love, memory, and the will to build can never be washed away. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe for more. Don't miss the next one, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it.